starts.
Yeah, you still have 5 minutes, but let's say you can start because anyway nobody else will enter in the room anymore.
Oh, I see, I see.
There.
And I thought you were going to say, well, but you can start because nobody cares.
I'm not there saying that.
No, no, okay, yes. You know, Fred is so polite, so nice to everyone, so Belgian. Well, yeah, I may not be. Anyway, we are going to talk about this very interesting topic about MySQL 8 and MariaDB 10.4, which are latest version of those two respectful databases. And even though, you see? Oh, now it turned over. Even though Fred gave me extra 5 minutes, I planned for 20 minutes, right? And as I look at this problem, this content, there is so much of difference those days between the latest MySQL and MariaDB. It's really hard to go in a feature by feature, right, and explain it in 20 minutes. That would require like a day tutorial, if not more. So I decided to instead focus on mostly high-level comparison, right, not going in a very high level, very low level details. One thing I think is important to know is what, if you look at the MySQL and MariaDB, is what MariaDB is not MySQL. Not anymore. I think in the first, right, when at Origin, there was a very little difference when it was, you know, 5.5 version, but at the later times there is a lot of changes both in what you have to do as administrator as well as the things you have to care or as a developer, right? Some of those things, I think this is, I would say, the differences of a worst kind, if you will, right? Because you would have their SQL syntax, right, of functions, of features which are the same syntax-wise, but they have a subtle differences in behavior, right? And why I call those things the problems of the worst kind, because if MariaDB has a function and MySQL doesn't, then it's very simple. Your application just wouldn't run, right? If a functions have some subtle corner cases about how it performs, then your application may fail in kind of a tricky scenarios, right? And that is something which is very hard to test. So keep it in mind, right? Number of applications those days, especially if you think about the Drupal, right, the WordPress, they tend to support both MariaDB and MySQL, but that requires a special effort by development teams to take software for both database systems, right? Don't assume if you have been developing for years just for MySQL, just for MariaDB, you can just move your complicated application and it works absolutely the same with no changes. Having said that, I will say what those are both great databases, right? We have developed a very strong followers, very large community. They have been both growing very rapidly. You may have seen MySQL, for example, getting the award from DB Engines about being the database of the year of 2019, which they didn't get like for, I don't know, like ever, right? And MariaDB was a runner-up last year, second only to Postgres. So both of them are doing well. Now, in terms of, I will try to be fair, but mine kind of fair. I hope I will offend and give things to disagree for both MariaDB and MySQL team members and the communities. And I see there's a fair amount of development team representation. So if you don't agree with me, then shoot, Peter, you're on. That is bullshit, right? Let's keep FOSDEM spirit going. Right, Fred? Okay. So let's start from a development model, right? We all know what the MySQL is developed by the Oracle Corporation, right? And contrary to some rumors, right? Oracle actually does accept contributions, right? There have been a number of things, both small and large, which have been accepted and included in the recent MySQL release. Oracle offers also follows what I would call like a dropship open source model, right? So it's not like all the development, all the kind of small patches, every commits are immediately visible in a GitHub, but when the Oracle releases the new release, we have a source which magically appears. If you look at for MariaDB, here is I think is interesting, right? Because with MariaDB there are two involved entities, MariaDB Corporation and MariaDB Foundation, and different components which we may use in an ecosystem is owned by those different entities, right? So for example, MariaDB server is released by MariaDB Foundation, right? And a lot of development and roadmap is mostly driven by MariaDB Corporation, right, in terms of features which go in. At the same time, contributions are very much encouraged, right? I think MariaDB spends a lot of time and effort to really invite people to contribute, right? And which is a I would say, two sides coin, because on the one extent that really gets more stuff in MariaDB, but then that also means you may have a not as much consistency between the features, right? You have more stuff to maintain. There can be more stuff which is of unknown quality because it was sort of contributed, right? But when developer who have been doing that is not really interested to do that anymore, and MariaDB Foundation, which is in charge with maintaining the server, it is a relatively small company, right? They cannot really maintain everything which was contributed over years. And development for MariaDB is done much more in public. I would say everything what the MariaDB Foundation does, right, is of course completely in public, but there could be bits and pieces which are developed by the third parties and then kind of also drop shipped, right? So for example, if you look at Galera 4 development, right, which was developed a lot, we heard about, hey, it's coming, but you could not see any source until it finally landed much closer to the GA stage. Now, MariaDB Corporation and complications, right? I mentioned what the relationship is complicated, right? But first I want to say, why do you really care, right, as a developer? Well, if you look at the history of the MariaDB, a lot of that was based on, well, you know what? Oracle bought MySQL. It's going to kill it, right? Or at least screw it up, big deal. We don't want to happen that again, right? So there is MariaDB Foundation to prevent that from happening. Because in the end, if you think in a corporation, nothing prevents from Oracle, theoretically, to buy MariaDB Corporation, right? That is a company of investors and so on and so forth, right? I was in MySQL in the early days, and we never imagined that MySQL will end up in Oracle hands at that time, right? But that's exactly what happens. So, so why that is important is if you are really looking at the MariaDB from the from an insurance standpoint, right? You need to understand what is provided by MariaDB Foundation versus not, because if MariaDB kind of corporation is bought by another Oracle, another company, right? You want to know what will kind of remain. MariaDB Foundation is really responsible for MariaDB server, right? Many other components such as connectors, MaxScale are owned by MariaDB Corporation. A lot of the stuff what MariaDB Corporation does is open source. Some things like MariaDB MaxScale is not, right? It's released BSL. Now there are also some things which I would find strange, right? So for example, where you look at the majority of repositories and packages for Linux distribution are managed and provided by MariaDB Foundation, but then Docker builds are Docker builds are done by MariaDB Corporation, right? So it can be really complicated, from my opinion, to understand who is doing what. Okay, now let's look about the what is open source when it comes to the MySQL. Like when you hear what the MySQL is an open source database, of course this is not entirely the truth, right? MySQL is an open core database. There is a MySQL community server, right, which is open source, as well as a lot of other tools which exist, which are open source. I think what is interesting about the Oracle MySQL approach, we keep the whole platform has an open source version, right? So there is a thing like a MySQL router. There is open source version of a MySQL shell and whatever, right? So their approach has been, well, you know what, you should be able to spin it up and do everything with an open source version, right? Then there are some enterprise features which is part of a enterprise platform, right? Enterprise is really focused on the commercial license plugins and tools, right? And I would say even in this regard, Oracle is actually doing a good job for themselves, but actually also for third parties by not having kind of another enterprise source code, right, which is kind of sparkled with enterprise features, but having enterprise features as plugins, which allows third parties to implement similar functionality as they want, right? Percona has implemented similar functionality for many enterprise options, and I know a number of people who has been doing that themselves. It is possible. And I think what is also interesting in this case is what the MySQL only adds some new features. Some of them go to enterprise, some of them they go to their proprietary. Some of them actually seems to be slated for Oracle Cloud only, right? Some of us have heard about this, wonderful Rapid engine, for example. But what I think is great is Oracle never took anything back, like, oh, that was open source license, and that's not anymore. In the MariaDB space, we have MariaDB server is obviously open source. MariaDB connectors are open source, so many of them are managed by corporation. There are some other parts of the sort of complete solution, and most importantly, I would say MaxScale is not open source. And I think what is also interesting in this case is what there is a history of what MaxScale was open source and later was a relicensed proprietary, right? So that is a question to what exactly may follow that rule depending on the MariaDB Corporation business needs and business pressures, right? Of course, we can be sure MariaDB server is going to remain open source for two reasons, right? A, it's MariaDB Foundation, and B, because it uses a lot of original code base from MySQL and Oracle, right? They can't really relicense that. For MariaDB Enterprise Server, right, you can, that is as a part of a MariaDB Enterprise offering, you can see what it is open source, but the open source for the customers, right? That means you don't really find it on a GitHub, but if you are the customers, then you will be provided access to the source code together with, the binaries. And to be frank, that is something what MySQL, one of the iterations in the MySQL history, that's what MySQL used to do, right, many years ago. Okay. So another thing that is interesting is the relationship with the open source and the community version, where MySQL Enterprise is a superset of MySQL Community. Wherever runs, wherever using MySQL Community is included in the MySQL, is MySQL Enterprise, right? And they're also aligned on a release schedule, right? So when you have, 8.0 goes GA, MySQL and MariaDB, it is the same. In a MariaDB case, MySQL Enterprise Server is extended superset of Community Server, So that means there are some features, right, which are additional in the enterprise plugin. For example, it would have a, an enterprise audit plugin which has some additional functionality. But there are some things which is included in community edition of MySQL, which is not included in the enterprise. And also MariaDB platform, right, which is how MariaDB enterprise version is called, works on a separate life cycle, right? So MariaDB 10.4 was released last summer. MariaDB platform X4, which is based on MariaDB 10.4, was released just in the last few weeks, right? So that is, I think, is also interesting difference. Now, another thing I think is interesting is about the cloud native, right? Supporting the Kubernetes ecosystem, right? And in this case, I would frankly say that both MySQL and MariaDB get thumbs down from me, right? I mean, if you look at MySQL, they have been have a release of MySQL Kubernetes operator. When the alpha was released, what was about like 2 years ago, they were very excited, saying, yeah, that's cool, MySQL understands that community is important. But that was not updated for 8 months. And there was MariaDB Kubernetes operator, which was actually one of the launch operator of Red Hat's Operator Hub. And it's kind of disappeared in public, right? And many pages which seems to be describing what the operator resultant page not found, right? So I don't I wasn't able to find much public information about fate of MariaDB operator, right? And there are third-party operators exist with MySQL, of course, right? There are some, I would say, Helm builds from Bitnami. There is a Press Labs which does some operator, right? We do at Percona operator for Percona XRB cluster. So there is some ways, but not from the main vendors at this point. Okay, let's look at the focus now. If you look at MariaDB, it's initially competed with MySQL on features, right? And there are many features came in MariaDB first, right? But I think what is more recently focus has been really is had a very good enterprise database as a target migration from an Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, and so on. I think another thing that MariaDB does very well is usability for sysadmins. Like if you think about startup scripts, command line experience, right? Whereas you kind of a classical old-timer sysadmins DBAs, that is very good. MySQL, I think, has been focused on the traditional MySQL use case, right? For a lot of large internet companies, right? Many of them continue to run MySQL many years in, right? They also did improve in SQL support like CTE, window and function, so on and so forth. In many cases that lagged behind MariaDB, but it's now there. Docstore and JSON has been a huge focus. And I think MySQL looked at the usability a little bit differently, focused maybe on kind of developers who don't know what I'm doing, right? So MariaDB is usability for smart people. MySQL is usability for stupid people. Right, if you think it this way, right? So you can have a MySQL shell which allows you to provision, configure MySQL cluster in minutes, right? There, well, it will probably take you significantly longer time, right? If you want to set up a Galera cluster with MySQL. Okay. In terms of architecture, I think MySQL started with work of very painful refactoring the old architecture, right, which is tough, right? And I think that is a very tough days for MySQL when we have, bite a bullet and change the data dictionary, for example. But it's not really as stable as a mature, right? It actually sucks in places, all right? But that I think over long term would allow to solve a lot of problems. I think another thing I will highlight is there have been a tendency on some needlessly complex decisions in MySQL, right? For example, MySQL GTIDs. Oh my gosh, right? I mean, this is like, well, if you probably don't have 2 PhDs, you don't really understand what the hell is going on, right, and how it works, right, in this case. And with that, I would say if you look at especially initial versions, they have been very advanced GTIDs, but you couldn't upgrade them live when they first roll out in MySQL 5.6, right? So that's kind of practical use case was not really thought through. MariaDB, as I mentioned, is pushing the old code base, right, much further. It really prioritizes choice and flexibility, right? And I think that also comes from accepting a lot of contributions, has support of multiple engines, right? And I think MariaDB team is much more kind of closer to practical operations, right, than a lot of folks in the Oracle development team, right? Well, which is easier with, you know, smaller, more agile, flatter organizations. Okay, you know.
5 minutes.
Yes, 5 minutes. Okay. Release frequency, which you can see is different. MariaDB is much faster, but what I think is important here is what what we have the change in the policy, right? Where MariaDB continues to focus sort of like a classical MySQL policy, introducing features only in major releases. We have relatively frequent major releases, right? Once a year recently. We don't have any minor changes in the minor releases, right? And the MySQL 8 is evergreen release, right? MySQL 8 forever. Well, at least forever as in the next few years, it seems. Where we have a lot of cool features introduced in the minor releases, like, you know, hash join, right, for example, was added in the you know, latest release. But what that also means, what there is a potential breakage with the minor releases, and you can't even do the downgrades between the minor releases, right? Which I know freaks out a lot of the MySQL old-timers, right? Let's say, oh my gosh, that is, you know, just horrible, horrible. Okay, some specifics, right? And I have now, what, 3 minutes. So anyway, you'll have the slides. There are differences, right? In, for example, client protocol, there is a difference in terms of what kind of interface support. I think the most important one here is MariaDB doesn't do doc store, right? Probably doesn't believe in doc store. JSON support is very different. I would say what at this point I think the MySQL JSON support is significantly more advanced than it had in MariaDB, right? Replication, again, that is another place very, very different. MySQL has a group replication. MariaDB has Galera replication. In my opinion, in places, Galera replication is still more advanced than group replication in places and more mature in many places. But group replication is moving faster, right, at a faster rate. SQL standards. I looked at this case, and I don't think MySQL now offers something what MariaDB doesn't in the latest version, right? And MariaDB has done a lot of stuff, especially focused on, as I mentioned, migration from things like Oracle. It has system version tables, sequences, packages, and actually a lot of some other stuff out there. If you want to have some detailed feature comparison, I think this MoreSQL.com, we had a couple of articles covering MySQL 8 and also MariaDB 10.3, right? We don't have an article for 10.4, which adds stuff. But that is fantastic, compare all those kind of detailed SQL features, not only comparing them to between each other, but also comparing to Postgres, you know, and a bunch of commercial databases. Security. That is another piece which is very different between MySQL and MariaDB, right? So how you manage user accounts, especially if you use advanced features like roles, plugins, very different. Don't have any time to go in
1 minute.
In details. Yeah. Optimizer. Optimizer is another piece which is a very different, right? Both teams can show you benchmarks to show that their optimizer is amazing and blows other part out of the water, right? But the thing you need to know is it is different. You should expect different execution plans, especially for more more complicated queries, which is important, right, from migration. And that's exactly on time. That's it. Thank you, Fred, for keeping me on track.
You have time for 40 questions if you want.
5 minutes for questions.
No, not some time, for 1 or 2 questions, not 5 minutes.
Oh, not 5 minutes? Okay, yeah. I have some time for questions. Questions, comments? Anyone? Yeah, Ole.
MariaDB Enterprise server only open source for customers. Is that legally okay?
Well, I mean, what GPL says, right, as I understand, again, not a lawyer, not a lawyer, right, but it says, well, you know what, when you give somebody binaries, you have to provide them with source code as well, right? But it doesn't say what you have to provide was make your source code publicly available. Now, what is important is MariaDB customers can actually do the Jeremy Cole thing, right? If somebody remembers in the MySQL days, Jeremy Cole, right? He bought subscription for one MySQL enterprise and he published a source code, right? Yeah, publicly, right? So they can do it, but MariaDB Corporation is not forced to make it public. But some of our customers can. Make sense?
Thank you, Peter.
Okay.